Hello, welcome to Market Hall Museum in Warwick. This is the second of a series of short promotional films to advertise the exhibition Cars for Speed and Glamour, which is currently on display at the museum and will continue to be so between May 2021 and March 2022. Now today I'm going to be discussing the Cape Works, which was the original home of the Donald Healey Motor Company and was literally based about 20 minutes walk away from where we are at the moment in the museum. I shall also be mentioning some of the early models that were built there, which are now known as the Warwick Healeys. Now I hope you get a chance to come and have a look at the exhibition, but if not, you may also be interested to know that a lot of the archive material that was used in the exhibition is housed at the Warwickshire County Record Office, which is also not far from here, and that's where I work. And we hold a substantial amount of material relating to the Donald Healey Motor Company, which we acquired about 5 or 6 years ago. And as I say, most of the archive material in the exhibition was drawn from that collection. Now, during the last posting, I discussed Donald Healey's career up to the Second World War, but it's after the Second World War that the connection with Warwick really begins. Now, during the war, one of the companies that he worked for was Humber, which became part of the Roots Group. And while he worked there, he met Ben Bowden, who was the chief body draftsman, and a guy called Sammy Sampietro, who was a chassis designer. And he began to discuss with these men the possibilities of building a sports car. They both had ambitions to do something like that, and the possibility of setting up a company to do so. So they started to design a car in their spare time while they were still working for Humber. And they started to discuss a possible collaboration with Triumph as one option for this car, but that didn't come to anything. So after the Second World War has finished, Donald Healey sets up his own company. And one of the first people that he employs is a guy called Roger Menadue as chief engineer. Now, Roger Menadue was an old friend of Donald Healey's. He'd worked with him at Triumph, and he was a fellow Cornishman, and he plays a significant part of the whole of the story of the Donald Healey Motor Company. We've got actually on display in the museum at the moment a letter which is taken from the archive, a letter Donald Healey wrote to Victor Riley of the Riley Motor Company, and this was written in May 1945, and it discusses Donald Healey's intention to form his own company, which he's going to call the Donald Healey Motor Company. And it discusses various names for some of the cars that were considered, including Vindex, which was the name of the aircraft carrier that his son Brian Healey served on during the war. But of course, they eventually decided to call the cars Healey, which seems quite a sensible idea. So why Warwick? Well, as I've mentioned previously, Donald Healey moved up from Cornwall to the Midlands because that's the main seat of the British motor car industry, and his work was largely based in Coventry. And he'd also bought a house in Leamington Spa in Kenilworth Road. For those of you that are not familiar with the local geography, Leamington Spa is literally attached to Warwick, and both towns are very close to Coventry. Now, the company based itself in the Cape area of Warwick, and they initially were on a site that was owned by Benfords. Older Warwick residents will remember Benfords very well, that they were a company that made cement mixers. And Donald Healey was a friend with the owner, a guy called Wally Allen. And so he rented a space from him. But eventually he then acquires a former RAF hangar, which we think probably came from nearby RAF Honolly. And this is what becomes known as the Cape Works. It's an area of Warwick which is part of an industrial estate, and I guess this was just the beginnings of it, as the Donald Healey Motor Company was one of a number of companies that was beginning to sprout up there just after the war. Formerly, it apparently had been a pig farm in the 1930s and before, and it sits very close to the Grand Union Canal. Now, earlier I mentioned Riley's. They provided the engines for all the early models, as well as various other components. And the first rolling chassis was put together partly using tools that were acquired from Benfords for the purpose of manufacturing cement mixers. And in fact, I've also heard that some of the early models also were built with some aircraft parts as well. You've got to remember, this is just after the war, and a lot of components were in short supply. So the first rolling chassis that was put together was rather rough and ready, and it earned the nickname the Horror. And we've got a few photos showing sort of partial glimpses of the Horror in the workshop, in the collection. And also at Market Hall Museum, there is currently on display a notebook featuring the specifications specifically for the Horror, as well as some of Donald Healey's early diaries from the period as well. And when the motoring press got wind of the fact that Donald Healey was building his own car, he had to call a press conference because the cat was out of the bag, and so he wanted to explain exactly what he was doing. And so he commissioned an artist who worked for Autocar called Max Miller. Obviously not the famous comedian. This is a different Max Miller, and he was commissioned to produce a fantastic drawing of the first rolling chassis, and that is also currently on display at the exhibition in Market Hall. Now, all of the early Healey models were finalised at the Cape Works. The first prototype was assembled with the help of the Westland Engineering Company of Reading, and was tested at RAF Honolly. Now, a lot of the early models had bodies or frames provided by former coach builders such as Elliott's and Tickford's. One of the most distinctive of the early models was the Healey Silverstone, which was slightly smaller and cheaper than some of the other models, and this was widely used for racing. The early cars built in the small production line at the Cape Works are now collectively known as the Warwick Healeys. And they only ever made about 200, 250 of any one of these models. They're all bespoke cars, really. The experimental bodies for some of the early prototypes were cut and welded together by a company called Buckingham's. And they were based initially, we believe, quite close by in Miller's Road. So they were quite close to the Cape Works site, though eventually they did move somewhere else. One of the family members, Bill Buckingham, ended up working for the Donald Healey Motor Company for many years as a panel beater. Now, the last cars that were manufactured on the site were called the Nash Healeys. Nash was an American car company, and they provided the engines for the Nash Healeys. That's the first type of Healey car that didn't feature a Riley engine. And these were built entirely for the American market. And they were only built in their entirety for a short time at the Cape Works. Nash did a deal with the Italian company Pininfarina to finish the bodywork in Turin. And so the staff working at the Cape Works recall taking these rolling chassis down to the train station in Warwick, ready for their journey off to Italy. Once Healey had reached an agreement with Austin in 1952 to manufacture cars, that was effectively the end of manufacture of cars at the Cape Works site. As from 1953, Austin Healeys are then mass-produced at Longbridge. But I'll say more about the Austin Healey part of the story in a future posting. After that, the Cape Works site is largely used for building prototypes and also for fine-tuning of racing models and also servicing. Now, for a while, the site also then becomes the site of Healey Marine. Now, as the name suggests, Healey Marine is part of a lesser-known part of the company that basically was for the manufacture of speedboats. Now, this initially had taken place down in Cornwall, but once there was capacity at the Cape Works site, manufacturing was switched to the Midlands. But it was only a very small part of the company, and eventually they stopped doing it, I think, because they hadn't really got the resources to develop it in the way that they wanted. So instead they focused attention on the car manufacture. In 1963, they moved from the Cape Works site to Coton End in the centre of Warwick. But I'll say a bit more about Coton End in a future posting. after this time, the Cape Works site essentially falls into ruin. There are stories of tourists visiting the site in the 1990s and taking away bricks and various other bits of memorabilia. We have actually got some photographs showing the site as it was in the 90s when it's all run down. But there is a happy ending, because the site was eventually taken over by a company called JME, and they specialise in repairing and servicing the big Austin Healeys. So I think it's rather nice that this site of this famous company is still has an association with the Healey company. Now, when we first acquired the Healey collection about 5 or 6 years ago, as part of that project, we set about recording some oral history interviews with various people, including many who had worked for the company, some of whom remember the Cape Works site, and I think they're some of the most interesting of the interviews, actually. And they discuss all sorts of things, like somebody mentions the fact that it wasn't a very secure site and people could actually get in and sit in the cars. The fact that it was very cold in the winter and you used to have to put your tools in front of a electric heater to try and warm them up before you could use them. The fact that it was quite a small site. The fact that they were visited by American servicemen all the time in Warwick in the 1940s. That must have felt quite exotic, I suppose. Later on, when some of the big Healeys were serviced there, they would be visited by various famous stars. Somebody mentioned the actor James Robertson Justice turning up. One member of the Coleman family commissioned one of the early Warwick Healeys to be painted in mustard yellow, appropriately. They were also visited by Anthony Eden, who became sort of a future Prime Minister. He was also MP for Warwick and Leamington, so he was the local MP. Stories about them acquiring a Formula One Ferrari and deconstructing it so that they could create a Healey special, which they raced in the Bahamas. And Barry Bilby, who was the chassis designer for the company for many years, stories about him driving around the Cape with rolling chassis, testing them out with just a number plate tied to the back, which must have looked a very peculiar sight. So there's all sorts of interesting stories in these oral histories, and you can find transcripts of these on our online catalogue, Warwickshire's Past Unlocked, and also thematic extracts for some of these interviews can be found on our Warwickshire and also on our YouTube channel. So look out for those. So that's all I want to say about the Cape Works. Look out for future postings coming up on Austin Healey, the Austin Healey period, and also I shall do one on the Coat and End site. So that's it for now. Thank you.